Hi, it's Rob from the Brush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a quick tutorial on how to paint Bladegheist Revenants. If you'd like to support the channel, our Coffee and Patreon pages are linked below. Now onto the video. The first colour we're going to use on this one is Vallejo Black. Use this to do the top part of the robes and also about a quarter of the ethereal parts below. So you can paint down onto those ethereal parts. Just about a quarter of the way down. You want to keep the most part still white for the time being. With that done, we are now going to use some Citadel Baneblade Brown. Going to use this to do the trim around the front of the hood. I want to get this looking like a nice kind of deep brown leathery colour. Like so. Next up, Citadel Leadbelcher. We use this to do the blade of his sword. You've also got the chains on the kind of hooks that are hanging from the Bladegheist's torso. So we're going to paint the hooks and the chains on those. Next we are going to use some Citadel Retributive Armor. Use this to do some parts on the sword. So you've got the pommel, this little piece going down the blade, and also the crosspiece. Next up, we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Liberator Gold. I'm going to use this to do the face mask. Like so. Next up, we're using a little bit of Citadel Skullcrusher Brass. I use this to do the grip of the sword, and also there's two little square pieces on the chains, or like maybe rectangular pieces depending on which way you're looking at it. So we're just going to give them coat of this too. I'm going to use some Mechanicus Standard Grey. I'm going to use this on the Gravestone on the base, which you can't actually see at the moment. There you go, so just give that a nice coat of Mechanicus Standard Grey. Get that done. Next we're going to use some Citadel Deepkin Flesh. I'm going to use this to do the arms. And also the ethereal parts at the bottom of the Bladegheist. I'm going to start shading. We use Citadel Nuln Oil first. Use this for all of the chains, the blade of the sword. You can use it for the Gravestone, or if you want to give that more bluey tint, you can use Drakenhof Nightshade on there. Like so. I'm going to use Citadel Agrax Earthshade. We're going to use this on the Liberator Gold and the Retributor Armor. I'm also going to use it on those Skullcrusher brass parts on the chains as well. Next we're going to use a tiny little bit of Citadel Reikland Fleshshade. I'm going to use this on the grip of the sword, just to give that a slightly reddy orangey look. I'm going to use some Apothecary White Citadel Contrast. I'm going to use this to shade the arms. And also you can use this on the lower part of the ethereal parts as well. I'm going to use Citadel Nighthaunt Gloom. I'm going to paint about a quarter of the ethereal parts overlapping the black with this. So you can give this a reasonable coat so you get that nice kind of deep blue, and you want to drag that over the black as well so that you get, it's not going to be a blend initially, it's just going to be kind of like a bit of a rough line where the Nighthaunt Gloom stops and the black begins, but we will be sorting that out as we go along. Now it's going to be Citadel Nihilakh Oxide. I'm going to do the same again, but overlapping the Nighthaunt Gloom and the Deepkin Flesh. So you can see here roughly which areas we're going over here. And if the Nighthaunt Gloom isn't still wet, you can use a little bit of Nighthaunt Gloom just to keep that a bit damp, and then you can roughly blend that in with the Nihilakh Oxide. We'll be doing a full tutorial on how to do this kind of effect very soon. So now I'm going to go back and use a little bit more Nihilakh Oxide. I'm just going to gently and thinly spread this onto the Nighthaunt Gloom, just to smooth that over just a little tiny bit. Because it is quite thin, if you use it really sparingly, you can almost blend that in with minimal effort there. If you drag it away from the Nighthaunt Gloom as well, you will get none of it pooling on there. So it'll be thinner on the Nighthaunt Gloom than it is when you've finished dragging the brush. So the brighter part will be on the Nihilakh Oxide. Here we just stepped onto Citadel Snakebite Leather Contrast just to do this front of the cowl, like so. Doing that while we waited for the other bits to dry. Now I'm going to use some Citadel Apothecary White Contrast, and we're just going to use that to gently blend in the Nihilakh Oxide with the Apothecary White parts on the Deepkin Flesh. So as long as you get them overlapping slightly, that'll be fine. Now I'm going to use some Deepkin Flesh just on its own. I'm going to use this to lightly, almost like dry brushing, but you're just getting it on the edges of the ethereal parts, and that'll give them that nice kind of off-white glow on the blue parts and the Nighthaunt Gloom part. You might be looking at that thing in the Nighthaunt Gloom and the black doesn't blend very well there. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a little bit of Nuln Oil in a moment and sort that out. Just going to work on the top part of the robes now, using some Nighthaunt Gloom to pick out the details on these parts. This is just picking out the details to make them stand out on the blackness of the robes. Now we're onto the Nuln Oil. I'm going to use this to blend in the Nighthaunt gloom with the black. So all you're going to do is get a bit on your brush and drag it away from the Nighthaunt gloom. So you start off with the Nuln Oil on the Nighthaunt gloom, drag it into the black, and that will leave you with a slightly darkened area where you've put that on. And all we're going to do is do a couple of layers like that, and you'll slowly find that it starts to blend in with no effort, and that'll give you that nice Nighthaunt gloom to black blending. So you can see there, very little effort gone into that. It looks pretty decent. This is the second layer going on, just to show you how you can darken up those edges where the Nighthaunt gloom actually joins the black initially. You can just go around and put a little bit more on that, and that will darken that up and blend it in nicely. Now I'm going to use some Citadel Nihilakh Oxide. Use this to pick out some of the details on the robes. So where you put that Nighthaunt gloom earlier, you're just going to pick out the very tips of those and the crests of those and highlight them with just a little bit of Nihilakh Oxide. That'll give them the final detail they need and that spooky glow on the blackness. Next up, a little bit of Citadel Agrax Earthshade. We're going to use a little bit more of this on the mask just to darken that up and give that kind of grimy texture. I'm going to go back to some Deepkin flesh. I'm going to start reapplying this onto the arms and bring them out so the details are a little bit brighter. Despite only being small areas, they do have some little details on them. You've got that kind of concave between the two bones in the forearm. You can also see the backs of the hands and the fingers. There's plenty of details to pick out there. Now I'm going to use some Citadel Liberator Gold. We're just going to use this to pick out some of the details on the mask, like there's plenty of dents and bumps, some of the ridges around the eyes and the nose and that kind of thing. So you just want to pick those out so that they stand out that little bit more. Now we're going to use some Vallejo Modeler Chrome mixed with the Liberator Gold. And we're just going to use this to pick out the details on the grip of the sword, and also going to pick out a few little details on the mask too. And the grip of the sword tends to have like a diagonal stripy lines going down it, so you can just pick out these highlighty bits. You don't have to do all of them, just as long as you get some of them showing. That'll give that enough detail to stand out. Now going to Citadel Retributive Armor, we're going to work on the crosspiece of the sword, the little bit that goes down the blade, and also the pommel. And leave any areas on the undersides still shaded, because they wouldn't be picking up much light. Try and give a bit more colour back to the areas that will be picking out the light. Of course, leaving the shade in the recesses. Now I'm going to use some Liberator Gold to highlight that. So again, you're only putting the Liberator Gold on the areas that would be catching a light. like so. Vallejo Model Air Chrome mixed with Liberator Gold now. We're just going to do those final highlights on the Retributor Armor Gold sections. Just pick out some of the details on these little square bits too to make them stand out. Now we're going to use a little tiny bit of Citadel Seraphim Sepia. I'm going to use this on the chains and on the blade just to add a little bit of that rusted, aged weapon colour. I'll link in the bladed weapons tutorial I did a while ago. That shows you how you can do some bladed weapons, or if you want to leave them looking aged, you can do them like this. Now for some Agrax Earthshade, doing much the same as we've just done, but covering a smaller area than the Seraphim Sepia. Now a tiny little bit of Citadel Balor Brown. I'm going to use this to highlight the leather piece on the front of the cowl. You can just use this to pick out the details. If you're doing a kind of rough and ready way, it'll look like the leather is scuffed. So rather than dragging it like lengthways along the leather piece, if you do it horizontally where it's vertical, vertically where it's horizontal, you will get that rough leathery effect on those sections. Now I'm going to mix a little tiny bit of white with the Balor Brown. I'm just going to do that once more, just to add some final little rough sections to it. Give that another layer of highlights to make that stand out. I'm going to use a tiny little bit of riser rust and an old brush just to add a little bit of a orange hint to the blade. Don't need to go overboard with this, we're just giving it a little tiny bit just to make that orangeness stand out, make it look like it's on the verge of rusting. I'm going to use some Citadel Leadbelcher just to pick out some areas to highlight underneath the mottled areas of the blade, trying to pick out the edge of the blade too, any ridges on it, just enough to make them shine a little bit, make them stand out. Do this on the chains a little bit too, not too much because you want them to look a bit worn and weathered, but just a little bit just to make those links stand out. Now working on a Gravestone, I'm going to use some Mechanicus Standard Grey and just reapply some of that colour, making sure that you leave the Nuln Oil in the recesses. I'm going to go into a little tiny bit of Dawnstone from Citadel and just highlight the Mechanicus Standard Grey. Going underneath each little ridge or section of writing just to make them stand out. Any little cracks or details as well, you want to be highlighting those and making them stand out. Now we're going to add a little bit of white to the Dawnstone and just do a gentle dry brushing over the Gravestone to make those areas stand out just that little bit more. I use a little bit of Citadel Agrax Earthshade. I'm just going to use this to weather the Gravestone. And finally, a little bit of Citadel Euphonian Camo Shade, just to give that look of damp. So there's little bits of mildew and whatnot growing on the Gravestone. It's not been cleaned, it's not been cared for, so you want to have a bit of greenness in the area. Like so. And that is the finished Bladegheist Revenant. Really happy with how it turned out. Some quite impressive looking but very easy techniques there. But pleased with the overall effect. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media, linked below. Thanks very much. If you like the channel and you enjoy the content and you'd like to support us, our Ko-fi and Patreon pages are linked below. Thanks very much.